Hello and welcome to Life and Current Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in history that do not begin with an official declaration of war, nor with the first missile falling on a capital city. Sometimes, all it takes is a blocked strait, a seized oil tanker, a warning broadcast over international maritime frequencies, or a cold statement from the White House for the entire world to realize that peace is standing on an extremely fragile line. And at this moment, the center of that fragile line is the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow maritime passage, yet it carries the weight of the global economy. It is where oil, liquefied gas, strategic shipping routes, and the power ambitions of multiple nations intersect. When Hormuz becomes unstable, oil prices can surge. When Hormuz is threatened, financial markets can tremble. And when Hormuz becomes a battlefield of strategic bargaining between the United States, Iran, Israel, the Gulf states, and Europe, the entire world is no longer just an observer. According to Reuters, US President Donald Trump described the ceasefire with Iran as being on life support, as fragile as a patient kept alive by a political ventilator. After Washington rejected Tehran's latest response to the American peace proposal, The Guardian also highlighted this assessment, emphasizing that the risk of the ceasefire collapsing has once again turned the Strait of Hormuz into the central flashpoint of the broader Middle East crisis. But the issue is not simply one statement from President Trump. What is even more alarming is that, at the same time, military confrontations, maritime warnings, new sanctions, and diplomatic clashes are all pulling the Middle East into a dangerous state, not yet a full-scale war, but no longer a real peace. In today's program, Life and Current Affairs will take a deeper look at the entire picture. Why do the United States and Iran repeatedly move closer to negotiations, only to pull away again? Why could the Strait of Hormuz become Tehran's most powerful bargaining card? Why are Gulf states beginning to seek new security shields of their own? And why could an oil slick off the coast of Iran become a warning signal for the entire global energy market? Let us begin with the most important political flashpoint, the US-Iran ceasefire. On the surface, both sides are still talking about diplomacy. Washington says there is still a chance for an agreement. Tehran says it is still reviewing the proposals. But behind those statements lies a very different reality. Trust has almost completely disappeared. According to Reuters, President Trump rejected Iran's response to the US peace proposal, saying Tehran had not provided an acceptable answer. Meanwhile, AP reported that Iran continued to present a long list of demands, including the lifting of sanctions, recognition of Tehran's rights in the Strait of Hormuz, an end to hostile actions, and the handling of the nuclear issue in a way that does not humiliate Iran. This is the familiar paradox of many international crises. Both sides claim they want peace, yet each side believes the other is using peace as a tactical trap. For the United States, the core demand remains clear. Iran must not move toward nuclear weapons, must not use proxy forces to expand its military influence in the region, and must not turn the Strait of Hormuz into a tool of pressure against the global economy. For Iran, the conditions are entirely different: an end to attacks, the lifting of sanctions, the release of frozen assets, recognition of Tehran's security interests in the Gulf, and above all, a guarantee that Iran will not be attacked again. In other words, the United States wants Iran to de-escalate first. Iran wants the United States to lift pressure first. And it is precisely this gap that continues to push every peace proposal into deadlock. What is especially important is that while diplomacy remains trapped in confrontation, the maritime front is heating up by the hour. Reuters has described the situation in the Strait of Hormuz as a struggle between the United States and Iran for control over this strategic shipping lane. At a time when commercial vessels, oil tankers, and naval forces are all facing the risk of escalation, Iran has repeatedly issued tough warnings that any action targeting its vessels or national interests will be met with a strong response. This message is not only directed at Washington, it is also aimed at shipping companies, insurance firms, energy investors, and countries that depend on oil and gas supplies from the Gulf. Because in modern warfare, a shipping lane does not necessarily need to be completely closed. It only needs to become dangerous enough for insurance costs to rise, oil tankers to reroute, and supply chains to face delays. Once that happens, markets react immediately. That is why the Strait of Hormuz has long been described as one of the most critical choke points in the global economy. If Iran controls Hormuz, Tehran can place direct pressure on global oil and gas markets. If the United States deploys warships to escort commercial shipping, Washington risks being drawn into limited military clashes. And if a missile, a drone, or a fast attack boat is misjudged within just a few seconds, the entire region could ignite. Ladies and gentlemen, another development that has drawn significant attention is the reported oil slick near Karg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. AP, cited by several regional outlets, reported that satellite images appeared to show a suspected oil slick spreading from the western side of Karg Island, one of Iran's most important crude oil export centers. Al Jazeera also reported that satellite imagery had detected an oil slick covering an area of several dozen square kilometers near Karg Island. Although the cause has not yet been clearly determined, the very appearance of such images in the middle of a military crisis is enough to raise serious questions. Was this a technical accident? Was it the result of pressure on Iran's oil export system? Or was it a sign that Iran's energy infrastructure is being pushed to its limits? For the oil market, the greatest danger is not only actual damage, but uncertainty. Investors can accept risk, but it is much harder to accept a situation in which no one knows whether another oil port may be paralyzed tomorrow. Another tanker may be seized, or another shipping route may be cut off. If Iran cannot export oil normally, Tehran will face an extremely difficult dilemma. Slowing production could damage revenue and potentially harm oil fields over the long term. Continuing production without enough export capacity could create a shortage of storage and increase the risk of environmental incidents. That is Iran's double nightmare, being economically squeezed while also being exposed to technical risks within its oil industry. At the same time, the United States is not relying only on military pressure. Washington is also expanding the sanctions front. Reuters reported that the United States has imposed additional sanctions on individuals and companies accused of helping transport Iranian oil to China. Earlier, Reuters also reported that Washington had sanctioned several individuals and businesses accused of supporting Iran's weapons sector, including networks linked to drones and military supply chains. This shows that Washington is deploying a three-layer strategy. The first layer is military, maintaining pressure in the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf. The second layer is economic, targeting oil, Iran's lifeline of revenue. The third layer is military technology, blocking supply networks that provide components for drones, missiles, and precision weapons. From Washington's perspective, this is a way to exhaust Iran without necessarily launching a full-scale ground war. But from Tehran's perspective, it looks like a form of siege warfare, forcing Iran to prove that it can still impose pain in return. That is why tanker seizures, maritime warnings, military deployments, and hardline statements keep appearing again and again. Another very important point is the changing posture of the Gulf states. For decades, countries such as Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait relied heavily on the American security umbrella. But this crisis shows that they are now entering a far more complicated period of strategic calculation. On one hand, they still need the United States to guarantee maritime security, protect oil and gas routes, and balance Iran. On the other hand, they do not want to become launchpads for a direct war with Tehran. That is why many Gulf countries are cooperating with Washington while also keeping a certain distance, protecting their energy interests while avoiding turning their own territory into a target for retaliation. In this context, Saudi Arabia's strengthening of defense cooperation with Pakistan, or the Gulf states' efforts to diversify their security guarantees, is no longer just ordinary diplomacy. It is a signal that absolute confidence in a single security umbrella is weakening. The Gulf is learning to live in a world where the United States remains extremely powerful, but is no longer the only answer to every security risk. Ladies and gentlemen, another key variable is Europe. The Guardian reported that Britain and France have pushed discussions related to security in the Strait of Hormuz, as this shipping route becomes a strategic bottleneck in the Middle East crisis. The newspaper also emphasized that any disruption in Hormuz would not only affect oil, but could also threaten wider supply chains, including energy, transportation, and essential goods. This is an extremely important point. Hormuz is not only about oil. Hormuz is also about liquefied gas. Hormuz is about fertilizers. Hormuz is about agricultural supply chains, food security, shipping, and industrial production. When a strait is threatened, people living far away from the Middle East can still feel the impact through gasoline prices, electricity costs, shipping fees, food prices, and production expenses. That is why Europe cannot remain on the sidelines. For Europe, Hormuz is also connected to Ukraine, energy security, NATO's role, and the maintenance of the international maritime order. If the United States needs European support in the Middle East, Europe may use this moment to bargain for other strategic interests. This is the larger game that many analysts are now discussing. Hormuz is not only a strait. It is also a card being played across multiple negotiating tables at the same time. But beyond the calculations of major powers, there is one reality that cannot be ignored: the humanitarian risk and the daily lives of ordinary civilians. As fighting spreads from the Gulf to Lebanon, as Israel and Hezbollah continue to clash, and as airstrikes and rocket attacks continue despite ceasefire agreements, civilians are always the ones who pay the heaviest price. The casualty figures, the destroyed neighborhoods, the families forced to flee their homes, the fishermen losing their livelihoods because of polluted waters, all of these show that modern warfare does not only take place on the battlefield. It appears in every family's energy bill. It appears in the price of food at local markets. It appears in the transportation costs of small businesses. It appears in the fear of those living near military bases, oil ports, and strategic shipping lanes. That is why when we talk about Hormuz, we are not only talking about missiles and warships, we are talking about the survival structure of the global economy. Ladies and gentlemen, there is another aspect worth reflecting on: the information war. Reuters, AP, CNN, The Guardian, and many other international outlets have repeatedly reported conflicting claims from all sides. The United States says it has successfully intercepted threats. Iran says it remains fully ready to respond. Washington says Tehran has been weakened. Tehran says its capabilities have not only survived, but remain strong enough to inflict heavy costs on its opponents. Western media cite intelligence sources, while Iranian media deny or reject many of those claims. In an international crisis, the truth rarely appears immediately. It is often covered by propaganda, psychological warfare, political interests, and market pressure. One side wants to prove that it is winning. The other side wants to prove that it has not been broken. Investors want to know what will happen to oil prices. Shipping companies want to know whether the route is safe. Governments want to protect their image before their domestic audiences. That is why the most important thing for anyone following global affairs is not to immediately believe the strongest statement, but to observe the chain of actual actions. Are ships still passing through Hormuz? Are insurance prices rising? Are Gulf countries changing shipping routes? Is the United States expanding sanctions? Is Iran continuing to seize tankers? Is Europe deploying additional forces? Actions are where the truth begins to reveal itself. So the major question now is, what scenarios could unfold next? The first scenario is that both sides continue to maintain a fragile ceasefire. Small clashes may still occur, but they remain controlled enough to avoid a full-scale war. This is the scenario markets would prefer most, but it is also very difficult to sustain if trust continues to erode. The second scenario is that the United States and Iran return to real negotiations. This would require one side to make the first concession, or a strong enough mediator to help both sides find a face-saving exit. Pakistan, Qatar, Oman, or several European countries may play a role, but no one can guarantee success. The third scenario is that Hormuz becomes increasingly militarized. In that case, warships, drones, fast attack boats, coastal missiles, and special forces would all operate in a narrow maritime space. A single miscalculation could lead to a major confrontation. The fourth scenario is that the crisis spreads to other fronts: Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, or even shipping routes beyond the Gulf. This is the most dangerous scenario, because it would turn a US-Iran confrontation into a chain of regional crises. And finally, the quietest but perhaps most frightening scenario is a prolonged economic war. There may be no major battle, but Iran would be steadily worn down. There may be no official declaration of victory, but people across the region and global markets would be forced to live under constant instability. Ladies and gentlemen, when we look at the broader picture, This crisis is not only a story between the United States and Iran. It is a collision between multiple layers of power. The United States wants to preserve maritime security and prevent Iran from expanding its military capabilities. Iran wants to prove that it cannot be strangled without imposing a cost on its opponents. Israel wants to limit Iran's ability and that of its allied forces to create a surrounding threat. The Gulf states want to protect their oil and gas industries without becoming the front line of a war. Europe wants to preserve energy stability and maritime order while connecting the Middle East crisis to wider strategic interests. China is watching closely, because Iranian oil, energy trade, and competition with the United States are all part of the same chessboard. Therefore, Hormuz is not merely a strait. Hormuz is a thermometer measuring the fever of the world order. When Hormuz is calm, markets breathe easier. When Hormuz is tense, major capitals must calculate. And when Hormuz stands on the edge of explosion, no one can truly say they are outside the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, today's program from Life and Current Affairs leaves us with a very clear message. In the modern world, war is no longer measured only by the number of tanks or missiles. It is measured by disrupted shipping lanes, rising oil prices, financial sanctions, silent naval movements in the night, and the anxiety of millions of people who do not live anywhere near the battlefield. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz shows that the world is entering a period in which just one small choke point on the map can shake the entire global economy. For the United States, this is a test of power and escalation control. For Iran, it is a test of endurance and bargaining strength. For the Gulf states, it is a test of security independence. For Europe and Asia, it is a test of resilience against energy shocks. And for the rest of the world, it is a reminder that peace should never be taken for granted. And before we close today's program, Life and Current Affairs would like to leave you with one final question. If one small strait can make the entire world hold its breath, is the current global order truly as stable as we often imagine? Or are we living in a world where a single spark in Hormuz can send heat through every market, every government, and every household? Thank you for watching and listening to Life and Current Affairs. If today's program has given you a useful perspective, please continue to follow, share, and support the channel so you do not miss our latest, deepest, and most balanced analysis of international affairs. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next program.